Welcome to this mini bonus season of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, where yesterday's dinner is tomorrow's history. If you're a peckish person who is curious about the history of food and drink, with a sprinkling of theatrical intrigue, then you're definitely in the right place. For the next few weeks, I will be exploring how William Shakespeare used food in his plays as a dramatic device ahead of the release of my next book, Much Ado About Cooking, published in conjunction with Shakespeare's Globe. I will be joined by some fascinating guests who know a lot more about the Bard than I do. This short season will culminate in a live podcast event at the online Serve It Forth Food History Festival on the 18th of October 2025, where I'll be chairing a discussion on whether Shakespeare's arguably most foodie character, Sir John Falstaff, should be considered a glutton or a gourmand. You can find details on how to get tickets for that event in the show notes, along with links to my guest social media and books. One of the challenges of writing a cookbook based on early modern recipes is that the culinary manuscripts food historians like myself have at our disposal tell us very little about what ordinary people ate. They record the food largely eaten by the rich or the upwardly mobile merchants and yeomen. Take a dinner service listed in the Good Housewife's Handmaid for the Kitchen, published around 1594. The first course consists of brawn and mustard, capon stewed in a white broth, a pestle of venison upon brewis, a chine of beef and a breast of mutton boiled, mutton chewits or pies, 3 green geese in a dish with sorrel sauce, a pig, a double rib of beef roasted and served with pepper sauce and vinegar, a loin of veal with orange sauce, half a lamb or a kid, that's a baby goat, not a small child obviously, 2 capons roasted with wine sauce, 2 pasties of fallow deer, a custard, and a leech, which is a kind of sweetened jelly made from almond or dairy milk. And this was just one course. Another 1 or 2 courses featuring just as many dishes would follow. The author of this book doesn't tell us how many people were being served at this dinner, but given the quantities, it's probably safe to assume that it wasn't a family of 4 individuals. All of the dishes would be placed on the table at the same time, but this didn't mean that you got to try everything on the menu. You had to make do with whichever dishes were placed in front of you. So if you wanted some custard with your mutton pie, you were free to pile it on your plate, so long as it was within reach. As fascinating and delicious as many of these recipes are, they don't reveal what the common people ate, and this is where the works of playwrights like William Shakespeare are insightful. Helping me to dissect the food references in Shakespeare's plays to answer this question is Diane Purkis, Professor of English Literature for Keble College at the University of Oxford and author of English Food, A People's History. Welcome to the podcast, Diane.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's such a thrilling topic.
Well, I'm pleased you said that because I am a food historian, so I get the food element and the recipes, but as much as I do love Shakespeare, especially after doing this book that I've just written, I feel that I'm certainly not a Shakespeare expert, so it's been great to be joined by people that know a lot more about the Bard and his plays than I do. Before we get into discussing the Bard and his plays and how food is represented in that, I would like to ask you about how you went about representing culinary history belonging to the people in your book, English Food.
It's really difficult to find sources for food history that don't pertain solely to the elite. And most of what's sold as food history is actually the food history of what people who wore crowns ate. So if you go to a National Trust gift shop, bless them, there'll be tons of things labeled Tudor food or something like that. And what it will be very literally is what the Tudors ate. But I was less interested in that and more interested in finding out what I could about what people like me, who unfortunately don't have access to a crown or a tiara, would have been eating in the past. And so to find out about that, you have to be willing to scavenge really and forage for tiny little references in texts that are often about something else. Again, most food history is written around recipe books, but I'm perfectly certain this is true of everyone. I have a ton of recipe books where I haven't cooked a single thing. It's just not the same. What you eat and what you know that you could eat are
Yeah.
not identical. So I wanted to think much more about how ordinary people organize their eating and how they thought about food. So I really started on a big journey with bread. And in thinking about bread and thinking about the history of bread, I got very into bakers and the fact that being a baker has sucked since time immemorial. There has never been a time when it's been good to be a baker. It's always been a horrible job. It's always been a job associated as well with being a rogue and a thief. Because margins are so small in a bakery in any period, bakers do adopt a lot of cheating to try to make ends meet. So I just got really interested in this sort of sweat and tears of the fournie, the big basement oven, where you lived your whole life and developed baker's lung and sores on your skin from the flour in the air, and just sweated it out from 3 a.m. till 8:30 every day. And that sort of led me down a variety of other avenues. And you can even find some literary texts that refer to this. And since we're on Shakespeare, I'm just going to mention there's an amazing moment in Henry V where Henry is not very realistically reflecting on how much he'd rather be a peasant than a king, on the grounds that a peasant doesn't have any worries, he thinks. I want to burst out laughing at this point. In comparison with the awful burden of worries that he carries. And he describes the peasant as sleeping in Elysium because he's been crammed with distressful bread. And I really thought about that sentence, crammed with distressful bread, that the bread is the product of multiple distresses, the distress of the farm hands, the reapers, the sowers, the weeders, the distress of the baker, the distress of the miller, the distress of the peasant who's probably obliged to eat bread that's full of husks and bits of old grain that have been thrown away because the rich don't want them. And so I just did a deep dive into distressful bread and how being crammed with it is the opposite of good, that it's like something that you're given to pacify you, like you might shove a dummy into the mouth of a baby.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating chapter, actually, in your book, I have to say. I was listening to it again recently. And yeah, would put you off, I think, wanting to be a baker even nowadays, let alone if you could go back in a time machine. As you say, it was a brutal career. Oh, well, I say career. I mean, I guess people were almost born into it.
Trade. It's a trade, and it's governed by the guilds, like all the other trades. And the guilds are cliquey and they're like the mafia. So as well as that, as well as all the physical stuff and your ever wonderful customers, you also had the trade guilds to deal with.
Yeah.
Most food-related professions.
As we're on the topic of bread, perhaps we should talk about the types of bread that were around then. You've sort of kind of alluded to it with this quote from Henry V, and what they said about your social status.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, again, this is something that I was surprised by. Food historians typically will say that there are two guilds of bakers, the white bakers and the taught bakers in medieval London. And it's true that there are two guilds. But they then go on to say that the taught bakers made brown bread, and that brown bread was worse than white bread socially. And it's what you ate if you couldn't afford white. But actually what I discovered is that that's not really true, that the taught bakers could make any kind of bread. They made brown bread, but they also made white bread. And the white bakers, on the other hand, solely made white bread. So that's the difference, rather than that the taught bakers only made brown. So the taught bakers are actually a less restrictive guild. And I thought on further research that they were a bit more like German rye bakers, where we know now that it takes an incredibly precise skill set to make good rye bread. And it's really difficult because rye doesn't have as much gluten, and the gluten it does have behaves differently from the gluten in wheat bread. So the tort bakers were kind of like that. They had a specific skill set that they could apply. So I wanted to sort of move away from the idea that brown bread and white bread were a class index in the way that most food histories suggest, and suggest instead that what we actually have is a huge panoply of regional breads, most of which we don't any longer have enough details about to understand. So in the book, I talk a bit about some breads in York that actually James I asks for when he goes there, and nobody by that stage even knows what they were.
Really? And this is in sort of in the early 17th century. They'd almost
right.
died out by then.
Exactly.
Already.
And so
wow.
Just as we would expect, innovation brings obsolescence in its wake, exactly because, if everyone takes to eating ciabatta, which I actually remember happening. I remember when ciabatta, it's a fairly recent invention, sort of broke on the high street in a wave. And the standard French stick was kind of pushed aside by it and made partially obsolete. Probably a good thing because the standard French stick was awful bread. So in all those ways, if you have people buying X, Y, and Z, they're not buying A, B, and C. And that's been the case forever. It's not the case that there's a sturdy tradition that we nowadays disrupt because we're horrible capitalists. We were always horrible capitalists and things were always getting disrupted. So my sense is that the white bakers and the tort bakers actually just offered different kinds of regional treats somewhere like London, where you'd expect people, and people are just flooding into London from the Middle Ages onwards. So virtually the whole period where we have any detailed records. And if they're flooding in, they're immigrants from Yorkshire or immigrants from Lancashire or immigrants from Scotland. And like all other immigrants, they try to bring with them their own food traditions to a certain extent. And my overall sense is that the tort bakers were very much there for those people, that they were baking the Maslin bread and the regional barley bread that people from, say, the West Country would have expected and would have wanted, while the white bakers are offering a highly specific product in its way as specific as Starbucks or a bagel bakery to a particular clientele that's probably spent its whole family history in the Southeast.
Oh, I see.
So I think it's region, not class. That said, there is the very specific question of the manchet or pain de man bread, that the hand bread. And we know that at the court of Henry VIII, for example, these were baked specifically for the top table. And again, they're not quite just straightforward white bread. They're actually a hand bread, and they're enriched dough. So they look to us very like a brioche, and they taste a bit like a brioche. So they'd be a little bit sweet. They'd probably have some milk in them, possibly also some butter, and white flour that's bolted 3 times. So they'd have a very smooth, silken texture. But that's not quite the same as just saying white bread. Again, that's a highly specific kind of artifact. And it compares and contrasts with the trencher that the lower table has. The manchet or pain de man, it's produced in a period where people have started abandoning eating on trenchers for eating off elaborate plateware, increasingly made of pewter or even more expensive metals. And so as they abandon the trencher, which is kind of typically a sourdough ball type shape slice, onto which you pile your food, and then it's sort of like bruschetta. You pile the food on it and you cram it into your mouth like that. As they abandon that, bread too has to change and evolve to become something of a side dish rather than the means of conveying your food to you.
There's a scene in Coriolanus where the citizens are protesting about the hoarding of grain. So why was this quite pertinent to Shakespeare's audiences when this particular play came out?
Well, it would have been pertinent actually at any time in Shakespeare's career, though Coriolanus is actually his last tragedy. The reason it would have been pertinent is because the Little Ice Age, in a nutshell, in the period when Shakespeare wrote, the climate basically right across northwestern and Western Europe had cooled by 1.5 degrees centigrade on average, much as we've seen it warm by exactly that amount in our lifetimes. And just as we have seen some plants become viable that weren't before, and other plants become less viable, in the same kind of way, in Shakespeare's lifetime and a bit before, wheat went from being a pretty viable crop in the medieval warm. It's almost certainly introduced as a crop to England by the Romans because they love their white bread. And it grows reasonably well. It's like all crops, it's subject to the odd insect disaster, but it's pretty okay until the Little Ice Age sets in. At round about the time Dunwich falls into the sea in that great storm, where it becomes far less viable. And so you have people still planting wheat because that's what we always do. We've always had wheat. Wheat is the lux grain. That's what we want. But actually half the crop dies of the mildews and watery diseases that ensue. So there are constant grain shortages. And while that's happening, the other thing that's happening that feels very contemporary to me is that rich landowners increasingly want to sell the wheat as a cash crop exactly because its price is so high, rather than share it with the people who've helped make the crop viable. And so what we see right across the late 16th century, perhaps most of all in the last decade of Elizabeth's reign, the 1590s, is these enormous riots breaking out in the East Anglian ports, where shiploads of grain are being sent to the Low Countries to market, and starving people are watching these ships sail away with the only grain the area's managed to produce. So not very surprisingly, they don't take it well, and they try to get their hands on the grain before it can be loaded onto the ships, and they riot in the streets and try to demand that the grain be given to them below market price. The big one happens in Malden in 1591, but there are lots of others. And the result is the representation that we get in Coriolanus, where the populace are openly portrayed as so dependent on this foodstuff that law and order can't be sustained. And that was a genuine fear, perhaps most of all for people like Shakespeare, who was himself not an aristocrat, but somebody whose business life was dependent on the aristocracy and the greater gentry. Really, Shakespeare needed law and order to be in place for his career to work out as planned. You can't really be a successful playwright in the middle of a revolution. Just ask people, 40 years later and you'll see.
Yes, indeed. And of course, there would have been things like plague as well, playing havoc with theatre going and...
Yeah, constantly disrupted because they constantly closed the theatres as a simple thing that they could do to make themselves, probably more than anyone, feel like they were doing something about the plague. They believed that the plague was caused by smell and that people pressed together in a small space like a theatre or a church would be particularly contagious. But they also thought that theatres might make God very angry. And they were worried that the plague was being sent by God to punish people, like the 10 plagues of Egypt in the Bible. And so they closed the theatres in a bid to restrain God from smiting everyone with a thunderbolt. That, of course, led Shakespeare to write his great narrative poems. Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece are the product of plague theatre closures. But you can't make a lot of money out of narrative poetry. So he must have been hoping that things would settle down. Any artist, in a way, wants their background to be stable. They want there to be available food. They don't want to have to fight for every meal.
And presumably the people that were able to go see his plays were the common people, the working people. It wasn't something that was, like nowadays, it cost a small fortune to go to the theatre, or did it?
It definitely does. Well, that really is class divided, because if you went to the actual Globe as opposed to Shakespeare's Globe, there were expensive seats and there were cheap standing room spaces. So in all those ways, we see some pretty big differences between people's experiences and probably also frequency. But even if you were an apprentice and didn't earn very much, you would have earned enough to be able to stand in what was called the groundlings yard and see a play.
That's good to know. I think it's fair to say that many of the foods that were accessible to the labouring classes, like certain vegetables, are not necessarily couched in a positive way, particularly in the plays. So let's have a chat about some of these items. What was the deal with garlic or onions or any of that sort of family, the allium family. Why were they so reviled in Shakespeare's plays?
It's a whole category of food, as you rightly imply, that are reviled because they were actually considered unhealthy food. So I suppose when we think of how they're treated, if a lot of food culture is about disgust, and particularly about disgust for the effect foods have on the body. And alliums generally were regarded as difficult to digest, which in some ways they still are. There's a mild physiological basis for this. Some people's guts don't digest sulfur elements very well. So, in a nutshell, they produce very smelly farts if they eat an allium. So, and also there's human variability around the question of whether it gives you very bad breath. So these foods were regarded as, in some respects, the producers of the very ill airs that people believed would make them sick. But the other thing that's going on that's also really important is the sense in which the allium itself is smelly. So it carries with it that uncomfortable sense of a food that requires a lot of processing to be brought under control. So, I mean, a key moment with alliums is Fluellen in Henry V. Shakespeare wants to have a go at the Welsh association with leeks. So there's a scene where Fluellen wants to fight some people from elsewhere in Britain. And if he wins, he's going to force them to eat leeks. And this is seen as a terrible thing, that, you know, it's like forcing someone to eat a raw fish or something. It's seen as a sort of nightmare vision of something that nobody would dream of doing. And again, that's partly having a go at his Welshness, but it's also correlating that Welshness with a kind of closeness to the unmediated product of the soil. And this anxiety hangs around all vegetables in Shakespeare's plays, not just alliums. That vegetables themselves are worrying because they grow in the ground. Alliums, particularly, are root vegetables. They don't grow on a tree in a comfortingly airy, uppish sort of way. Instead, you have to dig down into the soil to get them. And Shakespeare actually depicts in Sir Thomas More, Shakespeare depicts an angry crowd attacking some Huguenot refugees on the grounds that they grow their food in dirt, that they grow root vegetables like carrots and turnips, that they actually grow in the soil, and that this is disgusting and beyond words horrifying. Which to us is just ridiculous, and it's ridiculous to Shakespeare too, but he also portrays it kind of lovingly, that this is the sort of prejudice that people are going to have. So it's satirical in the way that if I were writing a play about British people who'd emigrated to Spain, I might have them complaining that the food was too oily or too greasy or something.
Yeah. It crops up quite frequently, doesn't it? So there's references to roots, obviously, in Timon of Athens, turnips and the Merry Wives of Windsor, pig nuts in the Tempest. I don't know, what is a pig nut exactly?
Oh, I found out lots about pig nuts. I'd love to talk about them. They are a kind of wild carrot. In fact, they're probably one of the botanical bases for carrots. They're a very thin, narrow root vegetable that you can pull up, but typically it requires a special implement to pull them up successfully because the root breaks when you tug on it, which obviously ensures the survival of the plant, a bit like trying to get dandelions out of your lawn. So when Caliban talks about digging them out with his claws, he's thinking of using his claws as like these sort of probe devices that you could buy to dig pig nuts. Yeah, they're nice. You can eat them raw, also like root vegetables, or you could add them to a pottage. A lot of what people would have lived on in the period would have been a grain pottage with additions. And what they would have done is tried to look for wild vegetables and wild roots that they could add to give them flavor and also bump up. They wouldn't have put it like this to themselves, but from our point of view, to bump up the vitamin and mineral content.
And what was the difference between, say, the root vegetables and things like salads and herbs and how they were perceived? I mean, I think it's in it is actually Henry V, I think, isn't it? I think this word salad was born to do me good.
Yes.
We will talk about other plays besides
Yeah.
Henry V.
No, we will. But it's interesting that Henry V, which isn't the most obviously foodie play, is so rich in references to food because it wants to talk, I think, about Henry's kingship as coming from mastery of the land. And it wants to incorporate that sort of almost agrarian sense of the productiveness of the land into an idea of kingship. So I think that's why we keep kind of reverting back to it. Herbs and things that grow above the ground tend to be presented as sort of transcending the earthy and the material, and tend to be presented in a more positive light. The ancient world is enthusiastic about them. That said, of course, they also understood perfectly well that some things that grow as plants are poisonous. And they also understood that excess is a problem. And their basic digestive model is very different from ours. And this is where they had different tastes in herbs to us. And they had this love for tansy, which is very difficult for us to understand. And if you've ever eaten it, it's like, it's incredibly bitter.
It is.
And sort of feels like it's doing something very bad to your tongue and throat. But they absolutely loved it and made it into these things called tansy omelets, which are basically an opportunity to take your medicine. And in a way, that's what it was. They conflated food with medicine more than we do. And they felt that tansy was purgative, and they absolutely loved the idea of purgation. Virtually every home remedy, every medicine is really based on the idea that what you need is a purge. So you need to vomit something up, you need to excrete something out, you need to pee more. You need to defecate more, and that's what's wrong with you, that you're not doing those things. So they tend to associate the herbs they view positively with this cleansing process. The food they thought was bad was food they felt was difficult to digest, that lingered in the gut, and they believed it would then start to rot inside you, head back to the alliums in a different context. But also some kinds of meat they were worried would do this. And then it would send up deleterious vapors that would start to affect your general health and would be carried around your body on your blood as a sort of vast cloud of nasty melancholic stuff that would then make you sick overall because you had undigested food lying in your gut. So the answer was always the same: a clister or an enema or some kind of laxative.
So were rustic people's constitutions more hardy than those of a more genteel disposition by the dietary standards of the day? And thinking of the dietary treatises that you get from people like Eliot, Coggan, Bullen, Board.
They certainly thought they were, but I'm going to say it's a bit like the way that in the antebellum South, slave owners believed that Black women gave birth without any pain. It wasn't actually the case that they did, but yes, obviously it was a nice fantasy from their point of view, and it meant that they didn't have to do anything and could just breed from them as if they were animals. In the same kind of way, it was widely believed, and we see that in that passage from Henry V, that peasants led a healthier life because they ate simpler food. Now, in a sense, it's true that they didn't eat the huge array of spices that really characterized the food of the upper classes. And they probably also ate a little bit less fruit than the upper classes did by the middle of the 17th century, because by that stage, fruit and even early salads had become a prestige item. So you had a hotbed, so you could grow the first peaches in your neighborhood. You grew them in a manure bed, so it acted as a kind of heating pad underneath the tree. And the goal you set your gardener was, can you get your peaches ready before my neighbor's peaches are ready? In all those ways, rich people really tried to push the boat out on luxury food. And as they did that, they automatically compared themselves with the food eaten by peasants. And one difference they would have started seeing is tooth decay. So we know that Elizabeth I had blackened teeth because she could afford to eat sugar all the time, which was an important spice. You wouldn't have seen any peasants with black teeth. You might have seen some with teeth missing from scurvy, but they wouldn't have been blackened. So as people sort of looked around them, they started sort of drawing conclusions about what they might have seen that fitted with the ideology that they already had, which was that gluttony, eating too much food, and above all, drinking too much wine, was worldly and might be bad for your health. And it therefore followed that poor people, who were obviously eating much less and who were eating less interesting things, were in a way eating in the way the Lord intended, or eating in a more Edenic fashion, and that was to be preferred. But it was nuts, really, because in fact, most peasants would have been suffering with borderline malnutrition until about 1700.
Yeah. And that's interesting you mentioned the wine there, because I think there are a number of the dietaries that claim that beer was not wholesome or as wholesome as wine, which Prince Hal alludes to, even though he's got a craving for small beer, which is sort of the weaker beer that was freely available, I guess, as an alternative to drinking water. I'm not going to say it wasn't drunk because the water was bad. We know that drinking water was fine. People were well aware that if you put sewage in your drinking water source, that was a bad thing. But
yes, they did. Although, in a way, they had no obvious way of telling when that had happened.
No, yeah. But
we can run around with microscopes. The microscope wasn't invented till midway through the 17th century. It's one of the products of the Royal Society. So they didn't actually, unless water is obviously turbid, you can't actually tell what's in it. And they were quite anxious about what was making them sick. They were good at correlation. They understood that there was a connection, for instance, between summer and epidemics. But they couldn't work out what it was, and they tended to attribute it to this idea of smell rather than what we now know was probably a waterborne or airborne contagious disease.
Was beer then seen as something the common people drank rather than the rich people would drink?
Definitely. Yeah,
wine?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely right. Beer is essentially something that you drink if you can't afford anything better. So going back to Henry IV Part 1, when we look at Falstaff's pretty amazing bar bill, which also includes some interesting foodstuffs, it doesn't really include much beer. It includes lots of different kinds of wine, all of which would have been imported, and therefore all of which would have attracted massive import tax.
Yeah, I was in it. It's 3 gallons or something of sack to a penny's worth of bread, exactly. Or something ridiculous.
1 penny worth of bread to this great deal of sack. Yeah, I love it. And yeah, it's obviously a joke. A penny loaf was actually a measure. It was a way of fixing the price of bread. So depending on the price of wheat, your penny loaf might be this big or this big. So you ordered a penny loaf, but it's a bit of an inexact quantity, depending on how expensive flour is that week for the baker. So we don't know how much bread Falstaff was actually eating, but nothing like as much as he was drinking. No. And he illustrates that connection between gluttony and too much alcohol. He's also, his kind of person would also have been flavoring some of it with extra sugar, because the wine arrived in pretty poor condition. They didn't really have a system of casks. So it's going to be arriving in a big mess and probably going off already. It's going to be acidic, like that wine that we all remember from student days that sort of sat around in somebody's room for the week. And so people like Falstaff would then add spices and sugar to it, the way we might make glühwein or something like that, to make it more palatable. But that, again, is a luxury thing. Those things cost an awful lot of money. Whereas ordinary people, and this by the 18th century is portrayed as moderation and virtue, are mainly drinking ale, of which the yeast to make bread is a kind of useful byproduct. But ale's very dependent then on the success of that same pesky old wheat or barley crop that could be affected by the climate change that they're seeing. So the imported wine is paradoxically more reliable, though it's far out of the reach of most ordinary people.
So were there shortages of beer then, if there were issues with the mini ice age and everything, and did that affect, must have had an impact on like the barley production?
Definitely, yeah. There are, but there's also something else going on, and that's the Puritans. Bless their hearts, the little dears. One of my favorite moments in English history is the moment when, if you wanted to build a lovely church spire, you held not a cake sale, not a muffin sale, but a beer sale. And all the wives in the parish, instead of making cakes or lamingtons or whatever, made ale. And they're called alewives, and it's called an ale feast. And the local cake, whatever the local cake was, would also be served. And that's how you made money. But obviously, to Puritans, this is all quite horrifying because it's encouraging drunkenness and gluttony, and it's just unimaginably ghastly. So they increasingly try to shut down ale as a local business in the regions where they take over as vicar. So if you're a Puritan vicar and you come into, I'm going to say randomly, Ludlow in Shropshire, and there's all these people sort of diligently making ale to support the church, no, 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 stop that now. That actually did happen in the run-up to the Civil War in Ludlow, and you can imagine how well it went over with the locals. I'm sorry, no more ale. And that's why Shakespeare has that line, "Dost thou think because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale?" That's exactly what people around him were trying to say. But we want to be virtuous, and that means no more cakes and ale, not just for us, but for you as well.
Let's talk about cheese now.
Oh, yes, I'd love to talk about cheese.
Because it's one of my favourite foods. Why was this frowned upon? I think Joan Thirsk says that the rich were eating harder cheese, mature cheeses like Cheshire, or imported cheeses like Parmesan, which I guess would kind of figure with, if they were drinking wine and other imported spices and things. But it's often referred to in quite a derogatory manner in the plays, isn't it? The classic one is New Banbury cheese from Merry Wives of Windsor.
I love that New Banbury cheese. I don't know whether Banbury cheese, I don't have details on whether Banbury cheese was particularly toxic. Overall, dairy products were generally not much liked by the rich, especially if they came from English cows. And this is for the very obvious reason that until the invention of refrigeration, transportation was a problem. And the dairy product that the rich quite liked from a fairly early stage was butter. And you can just about make butter that you can carry from Norwich to London by salting it. And then they did. What actually happened to dairy farming in England, and it is really interesting, is that we turned our cream, the top of the milk, into butter rather than cheese. So butter's still kind of good. It's so good that even witches' Sabbaths fantasize about bread with butter. Cheese, on the other hand, was seen as a food that only poor people would eat. And there's a disdain for dairy in general. It's called white meat. And the very phrase implies that you're not rich enough or enough of a landowner to have anything better. Everyone's going to prefer red meat to white. Everyone's going to prefer that dark, bloody, mature venison taste to cheese. I mean, in Piers the Plowman, when he lists the food he's got left after at the beginning of spring, one of the things he says he's got is a cheese.
Mm.
So we can see from that a cheese is what you're sort of down to when you've eaten everything else that you might conceivably want to eat. It's that lump of halloumi you find at the back of the fridge when you're searching for something to have for dinner.
Yeah, I can see that. But it does seem it's a little bit, because cheese is so lovely. I can't believe it wasn't lovely back then. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it really was.
Some of it wouldn't have been, because some of it was made out of whey rather than the top of the milk.
Well, I think this is a thing with the Banbury cheese. I gather it was quite a thin cheese in terms of it wasn't a very deep sort of wheel of cheese, and that when you pared the rind off, there wasn't much left.
I don't know if you've ever had a whey cheese. They're not much made now. I've had one just as an experiment, but they're basically pretty chewy rather than soft and emollient because they don't have any fat in.
Yeah. Not very nice, in other words.
No, exactly. So I think that there's some desperation eating about the Banbury cheese.
So cheese is frowned upon. Anything to do with the Allium family, garlic, onions, leeks.
Yeah.
Beer's not great. And vegetables, great. Were there any foods that were sort of more revered in his plays?
Well, in a general way, the thing that you're supposed to like best in all contexts is venison. And that is reflected to some extent in Shakespeare, even in Merry Wives of Windsor, where there's that joke sort of Herne the Hunter deer hunting sequence. anything that you can't eat in Lent is generally regarded as better than things that you have to eat because it's Lent. So, and the fact that Falstaff is eating things like shot and herrings on a daily basis is a terrible sign. He's doing it to make himself thirsty so that he'll drink more. But so anything that wasn't a Lenten food automatically gets a boost from that. And the other thing that I think Shakespeare thinks quite well of is what I think of as festival foods. I've already mentioned the cakes and ale.
Mm.
And generally, cakes get good billing from Shakespeare. There are lots of jokes about cakes, including sort of slightly rude, bawdy jokes about cakes. And women whose name is Kate are often associated with cake. And they're sort of edible. And therefore desirable. They're sweet like cakes.
So one of the things I do on my podcast is I always invite my guests to a virtual potluck supper at the end of a little chat. And I think as we've been discussing Shakespeare, I think it's only fair that we should have Falstaff, as he's come up several times today, as our host. So he's going to be hosting the potluck supper.
Wait, are we going to get any drink if Falstaff hosts? Will he actually pass it all around, or will he just sit with it in front of him?
It's debatable. I think we might have to bring our own and keep it under the table out of his reach. But who else would you bring? What other Shakespearean character would you like to bring with you?
Well, I think we can rule out Coriolanus because we don't want anyone at the feast who says anger's my meat. Meat is a generic term for all food in the period. I think I'd like to have not only Henry V, but also the soldiers that he has his conversation with. So Henry and also John Bate and the other soldiers that he meets, and Fluellen to teach them all to eat leeks and to teach them all the value of eating leeks and alliums. Thomas More, because he bravely stands up for the vegetable growers in that play. And that's the part of the play that we know Shakespeare wrote. It's actually one of our very few manuscripts in the hand of a dramatist of the period. And it's a fantastic speech. If you've heard it at all, you will have heard it in connection with Brexit. There was a recording of it doing the rounds in support of immigrants. And Moore is really making the exact point that I keep wanting to make about English food, which is that our food has always been a porous food culture in which we've been delightfully open-minded and willing to try things. The sort of uncharacteristic lantern jaw of the immediately post-war period has now thankfully been put back into its historical box. The food renaissance we've seen in the past 20 years is actually a return to normal for this country. So I think we need some enthusiastic and warm-hearted eaters for this feast. And I think Shakespeare can provide them.
Excellent. I think that's fair enough. And what dish would you want to bring as your contribution?
Ooh, what a great question. Ooh, I'm tempted just to say bread because I bake my own bread. I have for the past 25 years.
Never have enough bread as far as I'm concerned at a feast.
Well, I think in that case, I will bring a large sourdough rye boule. So it's what Shakespeare himself would have thought of as Maslin bread. And it'd be a mix of wheaten and rye dough. And what you did was actually grew them in the same field to kind of defray your risk. By growing them together, you could hope that you could salvage some of both of them enough to make a sack of flour. So I think I'd bring a lovely Maslin loaf, a nice big boule that would last a family a week and perhaps would last all of us an evening.
Yeah, I think we can never have enough bread, especially when Falstaff's around, because we're going to need, if I'm guessing he would be a pretty good host on the drinks front if he hasn't drunk it all himself.
Would it be okay if I brought some butter as well? Because that would be witch related. And I try to write in the book about how butter was so crucial to the early modern housewife's economy. It was virtually the only way she could get any cash was making and selling butter. So if butter making went wrong, as it easily could if there was a witch in the area, then your cash also went down the drain. So I think I'd like to bring some butter in celebration of the East Anglian butter wives.
Butter sort of springs to mind actually as being another one of those immigrant foods. Aren't there a few comments about it being associated with people from the Netherlands and the Dutch?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And it's certainly true in this period that our strongest food relationships by Shakespeare's time are with the Low Countries more than with France. So food in the Middle Ages really dominated in the first half of the Middle Ages by the discoveries they make of the Crusades. So we got a lot of very exotic dishes that read to a modern person like a North African cuisine, and the same kind of spicing as that, like rose water, for instance. But then that switches over and we're dominated by French food after the Norman Conquest, particularly, but particularly by the sophistication of French food. And then by Shakespeare's time, we're much more dominated by the Low Countries. And then it changes again with the publication of La Varenne's cookbook and the Restoration exiles coming back and forming the court of Charles II. And then it's French again.
Yeah.
And then it goes Dutch again under William. So there's a lot of sort of flip-flopping between the different areas that we're in trade contact with. I particularly love that we prefer the Dutch herring cure to our own. That's very us. That's a very English thing to do. Someone else does it better than us and we like it better.
Yeah, I've certainly come across recipes that refer to the Dutch method, or in, particularly I'm thinking it must have been with regards to fish. So what's next on the horizon for you?
I am writing a book for William Collins on the English at sea. So it focuses on the lives of people who go to sea between Drake and Nelson, so sort of between Drake's circumnavigation of the world and the Battle of Trafalgar. I got started on it because I started thinking about what they ate, but I'm now just very interested in how they lived. I got fascinated by the weirdness of how they find their way. And how can you find your way to somewhere when you don't know what it is, even? What's that even like? If you set out for somewhere and there are no maps, there's not only not Apple Maps, but there's no maps at all. And in some cases, even the idea of a map hasn't been invented yet. What's that actually like? What's it like to sail into the literal unknown? So that's what I'm doing at present. And after that, my next project after that's going to be something about execution. So something grisly.
Oh, wow.
What I'm interested in there is that everyone knows, historians know this, but I don't think the general public do. Executions rise massively under Henry VIII and keep on going up in a really steep line, and then suddenly crash in the 1630s, and they never resume at the level they are at under the Tudors.
Oh, I did not know that.
If I ask you what characterizes Tudor England, you're probably not going to say that, but that's actually a pretty good answer. The number of people executed. And it's not just people who are famous people. It's not just, Anne Boleyn. It's ordinary people. It's people who've committed minor felonies like theft. So it's not medieval. It's something the Tudors actually choose to do.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
I'm just so fascinated by what effect it would have had. So when you went to do your marketing, you went to sell your butter or buy your bread, one of the things you would have been pretty likely to see is an execution, because they organized them for market day. And it's often performed by the town butcher. So there is a food link.
Wow. Okay. Well, I look forward to reading that. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation, Sam. And I look forward to hearing the podcast, breaking my usual rule of not really being a podcast person. But in your case, you're special.
Much Ado About Cooking will be published on the 23rd of October 2025, but is available now to pre-order. Take a look at the bookshelf page on the Comfortably Hungry Substack, where you will find links to Much Ado About Cooking and my guest books. I hope you'll also join me at the Serve It Forth Festival. Listeners can claim a 25% discount on the full ticket price by entering the code SERVE25 at the checkout. You can find details on how to get tickets for the festival in the show notes. Ticket holders will also get access to recordings of the live sessions, which include an interview with food writer Tom Parker Bowles, so there's no need to worry if you don't want to spend an entire day sat in front of your computer. You can find further details on my books at sambilton.com and follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. You can also follow the Serve It Forth Festival on the same platforms at Serve It Forth Fest. Comfortably Hungry was created, produced, recorded, researched and edited by Sam Bilton, with sound production and mixing by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. The music and sound effects are provided by Zapsplat.